Hello there everyone and welcome to another edition of Lydia's Crafty Corner with me, Lydia, in my little crafty corner. So today we're going to be making a magical monochromatic card and we are going to be using some of the new products in the release. So first up I have my stamp wheel and I also have a piece of blush cardstock which I've just placed on my sticky mat. I then have the large image from the Build a Garden Bougainvillea stamp set, and I'm just going to place this into position onto my blush cardstock. Now I want kind of a no-line colouring technique look with this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a light ink to stamp the images. I'm using the Sand Dunes ink, but you could use a different ink if you wanted to. It's completely up to you, just as long as you've got a light one that you're just going to be able to see the outline, but it's not going to be noticeable later on. That's the kind of colour that you are after. So I do want two of these so I can kind of cover the front of a card. So I am going to twist my piece of blush cardstock around and then stamp a second one of this image. The leaves did touch, but I am just going to kind of cut through those and then it's not going to be as noticeable later on. So I am going to use the coordinating colouring stencil for this. So I'm just going to add my cardstock onto a sticky mat again. This is the low tack one and I find that this works perfectly well with stencils and so I don't need to kind of stick them down. So the first one that I'm going to be using is the first stencil, so number 1 from the Build a Garden Bougainvillea stencil set, and I'm going to be using the rouge ink to add ink through the pieces of the stencil to add colour to the image below. So what I'm trying to do is I am adding more of that ink right at the base of the flowers or more of the flower petals, so we can get the kind of great look from the gradient from the dark to the light on the tip of the petal. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to do that again. So I'm just going to do that exactly the same on the other one. So I've just moved that stencil into position and I'm just going to add that rouge ink to the base of each of the petals to get that gradient effect there. Now we do have another piece on that other stencil, but I'm going to leave that till later on. So I am going to move on to stencil number 2 now. And this stencil number 2 has two other parts to the petals. So I'm just going to place each of these right into position on that stamped image that we have and then add the ink through, which is going to be the rouge ink like we used before. So if you do have a kind of harder job seeing the lighter ink, it might be a better idea to use a darker ink, but it's completely up to you. This Sand Dunes I find that works really well and you can even see it slightly on this video here. So you are going to be able to see it in real life a lot easier than you would from the video. So once I've done the first part of the petals, I'm then going to move the stencil and then we're going to colour in the third part. Again, we are going to be using that rouge ink and again I'm trying to add more of that ink to the base of the petal rather than the tips to get that really beautiful gradient natural effect that you get. So normally petals are not all the same colour all the way through, so this is going to give you more of a natural look with this ink blending technique that we have here. So once that's done, I'm going to move on to stencil number 3 and this is going to add in the leaves and the stems. Now I do want a monochromatic look, so to get the monochromatic look I'm going to have to use either a darker pink than I've been using or a white. So I chose to go with the cloud white ink that we have. And this is what I'm going to be using. You will need a separate kind of blending tool whenever you use a pigment ink from a dye ink because they don't really work well on the same blending tool. So I would recommend that you get yourself a new blending tool, a clean one, and then use that one if you are going to be blending with your white inks. As you can see, this cloud white is working perfectly as a kind of blended ink through the stencil and you can see that it just looks so pretty. I love that kind of ghosting effect that we get where the pigment ink kind of trails off and then you get that really light white. It just looks so pretty. So I have done the first part of the stencil on both of the images that we have and I'm just going to do the second one again like before, like we did with the pink. I am adding more of that ink just at the base of the leaves and the stems to give a more natural kind of gradient look to those images there. So once I've finished with this stencil here, I'm then going to move back to the stencil that we had at the beginning, and we didn't add the second layer that we had on that stencil. So I'm just going to pop that into place, and this is just going to add in the flower centers. And for the flower centers, I am going to be using that cloud white ink again, trying to add more of that ink to the base of the flower centers rather than the tips to get that look there. I then wanted to add more of a shadow or detail and kind of depth to the images. So I'm using the woodless coloring pencils, and this is the Coral Bliss pencil. And all I'm doing is I'm adding some strokes from the base of the petal out towards the center of the petal to give that really darker look at the base of the petals. And where the other petals kind of bend around each other, you are going to want to add a little bit of shading underneath the other petal. It doesn't take a lot of work, it only takes a couple of extra strokes. You can just add a little bit more of a scribble rather than a flick if you wanted to. But I am trying to add some of this detail and interest to each of those petals just to give us that darker look. And you can see here, I've done one side and I haven't done the other, but the other side that I have done does look more kind of curled and has a lot more depth than the one that we've got that doesn't have that extra shading on with the pencil. So it's kind of an extra step to this one. You don't necessarily have to do it, but I do find that it works really, really well with this. So once I'm happy with the amount of kind of pencil shading that we've popped down, I am going to cut out my images, and I'm going to be using the coordinating die. So this is the one. I'm just going to remove that from the piece, and we are going to use this to die cut. As I said before, these kind of bits here do touch each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut around them as close as I can, just to make sure that we're not going to cut anything out with the die that we don't want to. So I'm just going to pop that around the image, add a little bit of tape so it doesn't move when I run that through the machine, and then I'm just going to run that through my die cutting machine. And as you can see, once I pop that out, this is cut perfectly, and you can see even where the two pieces touched, it doesn't look too bad because we've just cut around those anyway. So I have my two images nicely cut, and I'm then going to move on to the background. I was just going to leave it pure white, pure pink. So this is the blush cardstock from Altenew. But I then decided I wanted kind of a shadow effect on that. So all I'm going to do is I am going to stamp the stamp that we've just used. So the one that we use for the outline on the ones that we've colored. So the Build a Garden Bougainvillea stamp set. I'm just using that same image to create a whole background on this blush piece of cardstock. I am using the cloud white ink, and I did find because the light ink was on the light cardstock didn't really show, that I needed to stamp it a little bit more time. So I did stamp it 3 times, and I do find that the stamp wheel works perfect for this because, you know, when you pick it up, you're still going to be able to stamp directly in the same place that you've just stamped. So once I have my background ready, we then can go ahead and figure out where these images are going to go. In the end, even though I've placed these into position like this, they didn't even end up like that anyway. But once I was kind of happy with where I was placing them, I then added some of the Instant Dimension foam tape behind the images. So I'm just snipping these and just adding a little bit of tape behind the larger pieces of the image. I can then remove the backing, and then that's going to give me that stickiness that we have. And because it's Instant Dimension foam tape, this is going to kind of lift the images away from the background and give us even more dimension and interest like that. So once I've done the first one, I'm just going to do exactly the same for the second one. So I'm just using the Instant Dimension foam tape just to add some little pieces of that adhesive behind the image, and then going to remove all of that tape before popping it down into place. So once I've added that, we're then going to kind of get rid of the overhanging pieces. So to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip my piece around, and I'm going to cut off all of the overhanging pieces from behind. I find that this works the best to do it this way because you can see exactly where you need to cut, and you're also going to get a cleaner kind of edge that way because you know where you need to go. It's not like you're kind of guessing if you try and do it from the front. So always turn it around and do it from the back. To add a little bit more interest, I am going to add some splatter, and I'm just using the pure white ink spray from Altenew just to add that into place. For the sentiment, we're going to be using the same stamp set we've used through the video, so the Build a Garden Bougainvillea. And I am going to be heat embossing this onto a piece of blush cardstock. So I'm just adding some anti-static powder, aka baby powder, onto my little sheet of paper before I stamp that using some of the embossing ink from Altenew. I do want the sentiment to be white, so I'm just going to be using some of the pure white embossing powder, and I'm just going to heat set that. Once that's done, we're going to go ahead and cut this out. So we do have the coordinating die available for this sentiment, so I'm just going to pop that around the sentiment, add a little bit of tape, and then run that through my die cutting machine. Now when I place this down onto my card, I found that it was getting a little bit lost, so to kind of counteract that, I'm going to cut another couple of layers using that same die. So first I'm going to cut some in some vellum, and then I'm going to cut another layer of that sentiment die that we have just from some solar white cardstock as well. So as you can see, I've just cut around those and then cut the sentiment without even stamping them. I can then layer this up, and this is going to give this sentiment some depth, and then it's going to in turn then bring your eye to that element. So I'm just going to add some of the glue tape from Altenew just to kind of adhere these all together. I was going to have them all going in different ways, but then I didn't like the look of it kind of going off that way. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those and then try again. So I'm just using a little shadow technique of kind of dropping that sentiment die cut off to the side and down a little bit, and that's going to give us more dimension. To add a little bit more dimension again, I'm using some of the foam tape from Altenew, but this time I've doubled it up. So this means this sentiment's going to be even brought more forward than the flowers that we have on there. Once you're happy with where you're going to place this, you're going to want to really stick that down so everything's nicely stuck. And then that's the card complete. I really do love how this turned out. The colors are just so beautiful. The rich tones as well as those cool white colors that we have. I really do hope that you like the card as well, and that you like the video too. If you do create a card that was inspired by this, it'd be great if you do share. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and we'll see you again really soon. Bye-bye. Hey there, Lydia here. I really do hope that you've just enjoyed the video. If so, please subscribe to the Altenew YouTube channel. Also, turn on the notification bell so you can get your daily dose of crafty techniques and tutorials just like this. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.